Hello everyone, my name is Leonie. Welcome to another video. I'm thinking to make this video a little bit more romantic. I'm just gonna light these candles right there. I'm lighting my decorative candles for you. Romance. Okay guys, so romantasy, portmanteau between romance and fantasy. Books that are very romantic, but they take place in a fantasy world. I've made videos about this genre before. I've always been a little bit skeptic, and I think a line that I've said very often is I love the idea of romantasy books, but every time I read them, I don't like them. There aren't many romantasy books that I actually love. So I thought I would make a video where I talk about the romantasy books that I did actually really enjoy. So for those of you who know that you have kind of similar tastes to me, you should check out these books. And I want to make it clear, a lot of these books I've talked about them before, but in this video I really kind of want to focus on talking about how much romance is in them, because that can sometimes be the question, right? You hear about a romantasy book and you think, ooh, I'm gonna read a fun fantasy book, and then the entire book turns out to just be romance. Or the other way around, you expect a lot of romance and then it turns out to just be like a secondary plot line in the background. So in this video, for each book that I'm going to recommend, I'm going to go very in depth about how much romance is there and how much fantasy is there. And I just want to have like a little bit of a discussion on why I think the romance works in these books, because I just kind of like thinking about that. The first book that I'm going to recommend is like the one hyped TikTok romantasy book that I did actually enjoy, and that is Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent. Really quick plot description. Everyone's a vampire except our main character. They all want to eat her. She enters a fight to the death competition with these vampires and has to team up with one of them, who turns out to be rather charming. I think this is a very good example of true romantasy, where yes, there's a lot of fantasy elements, there's some world building, there's this whole world around these vampires and the different gods that they worship, but it's not like super complex, and there is this whole plot line of this fight to the death competition that the main character has to go through that takes up most of the plot. But you can tell that almost everything that happens in the plot happens to further the romance. You know what I mean? If you're familiar with the concept of like hurt comfort, you know, you could tell that a lot of the like heavy and gruesome and violent things that are happening in this book, yeah, they're there for the plot, but they're also definitely there so that after the violent and gruesome things happen, our two love interests can like comfort each other and tend each other's wounds. So that's what I mean when I say, yeah, there's plot, but the plot is very clearly there to push the romance further. So why did I personally think that the romance really worked in this one? I think it's just like my personal preference for romance pairings where the female main character is a bit more like the grumpy one, kind of this like feisty fighter, grumpy girl, and then the male love interest is actually for once the more sunshiny one, like really charming and kind of funny and flirty and a little bit more outgoing, and I really like stories that have that. And Carissa Broadbent does a really good job at making it clear to the reader that these characters are growing towards each other through the things that they're experiencing together. They don't just like immediately have the hots for each other. Well, maybe a little. But I think she's good at writing a kind of natural connection that happens between characters. And this novel is also adult, and it's pretty spicy, I think. There's like a few spice scenes in there, and it's also clearly, the whole story is just clearly written to kind of aid that and really focus. There's a lot of focus on like the chemistry between them and the tension. I've also read some of Carissa Broadbent's other romantasies, like Six Scorched Roses and Slaying the Vampire Conqueror. I can never get over that title. And there are also, I like everything that she writes. It's super quick and easy to read, but Serpent and the Wings of Night, personally, I thought it was clearly the best one in terms of chemistry and build up in the romance. The next romantasy series that I'm going to recommend is one of my favorites this year, One Dark Window, which some people have called romantasy, and I can understand why. This is definitely fantasy first. It's fantasy first, and then there's a romance plot line as like a secondary plot line that is just kind of there in the background throughout the story. To me, it's very reminiscent of all the young adult fantasies of like the 2010s, where it's a fantasy book, but there's always a romance plotline in the background. It's personally my favorite balance between romance and fantasy. And if you read the sequel to One Dark Window, Two Dark Crowns, more character point of views get introduced in the second book. So there's a lot more romance and like a major plot line that revolves around the romance, and it's even better than book one. Here's why I think the romance really works in One Dark Window. So the first book, I always just like it when the love interest isn't some kind of perfect, amazing alpha male dude that is clearly written for the reader to fall for. That's gonna be a theme in all of the books that I recommend. Here, Raven are kind of like thief-like, roguelike. I mean, his name is Raven. Of course, he's a roguelike person. Our male love interest is very clearly a great love interest for our main character, right? He's not perfect, but they are perfect together. The vibe here is two reserved, kind of emotionally unavailable characters that are drawn to each other, going on little missions together. We love that. Nothing says romance like trying to overthrow the fantasy monarchy together. This is an adult series, so there is like a little bit of spice, but it's definitely not even close to being like the main focus of the story. It does get explicit at some point, but that's all. Another favorite series of mine that gets named romantasy by some people is the Cruel Prince or the Folk of the Air trilogy. This is even more an example of it's a fantasy series first, and then there happens to be a romance plotline in the background. But it doesn't even progress until book 2. So a lot of people pick this up because they hear it's amazing enemies to lovers, and it is, but there's no lovering. There's no lovers until book 2, okay? It's mostly their enemies. They hate each other, okay? They bully each other. They're fey, they're mean to each other. And I love that. It's why I personally think the romance in this works so well. There is a lot of interaction between our main character Jude and Prince Carden. Again, they are both very morally great characters. Carden is like a drunk prince that makes a lot of really egotistical and selfish decisions. He's not like a particularly swoon-worthy man, but he's perfect for our main character. You can tell that they really challenge each other and kind of work together as a couple. They definitely could kill each other, but instead they decide to kiss, so that's nice. They tried to kill each other many times. That's how I like my romance books. But why I think the romance works so well between Jude and Carden is because you get to see a lot of interaction between these characters. The plots are intertwining them. You know, they're kind of enemies for a very long time without it explicitly being romantic. So you get a very slow build-up of tension, of them getting to know each other, of them being in scenes with each other without it ever explicitly getting romantic. But all of the scenes where they're fighting are full of tension, you know, even though they're not fighting in a romantic way. They're trying to kill each other. So if you want romance and swooning, this is not gonna give you that. If you want tension between two enemies, that's kind of what happens for most of this series. That's why I think this is the best enemies to lovers out there. It is a young adult series, so there's no spice. Well, tiny little bit. It's a little bit more on the adult side of the young adult, but again, not the point of the series. I'm really starting to slowly notice a theme with what I'm talking about and what kind of romance books I like, because the same thing I can say about the next book I'm going to talk about. To Kill a Kingdom by Alexander Christo is a standalone romantasy novel about a romance between a siren and a siren hunter slash pirate, and they're trying to kill each other. Nothing says romance like that, am I right, ladies? It is not super romantic, but it is another example of how the entire plot of the story surrounds and pushes the romance. So most of it is just this cat and mouse hunt between the siren woman and the siren hunter man, but it's clearly there so they can fall in love at the end, you know? But that is again a reason why I think a romance like this works really well, because you get this very slow progression where they go from absolute enemies to interacting a lot to being around each other a lot until eventually it gets a little bit more romantic. One of the reasons that I love this book so much is because I could truly tell why these two characters would fall for each other despite being enemies at first. Because sometimes when it's enemies to lovers, you're just sitting there thinking, why are they falling in love with each other? Like, they clearly hate each other to this much of an extent. It feels like the author is just forcing love on them because the author wants to write enemies to lovers, but it doesn't make sense for them to become lovers after all that hating. Here you can 100% see why they're falling for each other, them kind of growing closer together, finding out that they have a lot of things in common, finding out that they may no longer agree with the reason that they were enemies in the first place. And this is how you write enemies to lovers in the best way, when both characters go through character development, realize that the things that they believed at the beginning of the story aren't real or aren't where their heart is, and because of that stop being enemies, because they have grown as people and they realized we're not each other's enemy. Why do we hate each other? It's just because of trauma. Love that. This book does that very well. It is, again, young adult, so no spice. The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. Oh, I love this book. I would say this is like a fantasy version of a standard like contemporary romance, because it does take place also in our world, except some people are witches and our main character is a witch and she is going to raise like 3 little orphan witches and falls in love with the librarian or historian. This is a romance book first, and then there happens to be fantasy elements because there are witches. Like I said, it really feels like you're reading an Emily Henry book or a Talia Hibbert book, like any standard contemporary romance novel. That's what this feels like, except there's some magic in there. And that is why the main focus in this book really is on the romance. Yes, there's also great tension and chemistry between the characters, but it is like romance and character first. Like the characters have a lot of conversations, you know, there's not a lot of plot happening. It's about the interactions between also the side characters, the friendships that brew between them, everyone getting to know each other better. There's a very strong theme here also about like unpacking family trauma and finding your new family, your found family, and feeling at home with new friends that you make, accept your home situation. Very beautiful, very cute, very nice. And that's why the romance works, because in this book there really is a lot main focus on developing the connection between our two main characters. It is adult, so there is like a little bit of spice, but like I said, the main focus is not on like the chemistry and tension. It's really more like romantic. I realized that Uprooted would definitely also count as a romantasy book. I realized while making this video that a lot of just the fantasy books that I really like are technically slightly romantasy books. So this is fantasy first, but a major plot line is the romance, because the main concept of this book is that once every 7 years this old wizard, well, he's old but he looks young, you know the drill, he's very like centuries old but he looks hot. This old wizard in a tower takes a young girl from the valley and they never return, and our main character gets picked by the dragon, and then she finds out by going to his tower that he is actually going to be teaching her this kind of natural magic, and they turn out to form this really deep and nice and also eventually romantic bond. So as you can tell, the concept of this book, the whole main plot line, very much aids a story about connection between these two characters and romance between these two characters. But despite that, the romance does stay a little bit in the background. There's like a whole war going on. There's like a whole fantasy plotline here with angry trees and girls with swords and stuff. The reason why the romance works in this book, I'm gonna be honest, it's been so long since I've read this book, but from what I remember, everything about the story is so beautifully written, so bewitching and whimsical, that everything that is written in this book is just good, including the romance. Like, you just feel drawn in by the magic in this world, and simultaneously you feel drawn in by the connection that starts appearing between our main character and this wizard character. The romance in this novel is of the variety young girl with technically centuries old mage, which I understand that some people would have thoughts about that. So if you think you're gonna have trouble with that, just know that that's in here. I read this when I was 19 years old, so maybe I just personally really like the idea of being taught magic by a hot wizard in a tower. A girl can dream. It is adult, so it does get explicit at some point, but there's like nothing really spicy about this book. Okay, let me recommend to you another romantasy where the romance really is first in the story, and that is Divine Arrivals by Rebecca Ross. This is a fantasy story where the romance is integral to the plot. Without the romance, there would be no story. And the story here is that two rivaling young journalists in this fantasy world start communicating with each other through this magical typewriter, but they don't know who's on the other side of the magical typewriter, so they fall in love with each other without knowing that on the other side is like their rival. And this is a romance novel through and through. It's a story about love. It's a story about finding love in hard times, in times of war. A lot of the story is reading the letters that these characters write to each other and seeing them slowly fall in love. And again, that is why I think the romance in this book works so well, because so much time is spent on seeing these characters connect to each other and seeing them becoming slowly more and more vulnerable with each other and opening up. It is a young adult novel, so the whole thing stays very mindful, very demure. Anyone watches this like 3 months from now, they're gonna be like, that's an archaic reference you're making. Then I have one recommendation where the two love interests are both women. So it is a sapphic love story, and that is Bitterthorn by Kat Dunn. This is another fantasy story where the romance is integral to the plot. It's actually kind of similar to Uprooted in the sense that there's this witch in this tower that takes a girl, not a girl, just anyone from the village once in a while, and then they never return. And then our main character volunteers because she doesn't feel at home with her family to go live with the witch. And while living with this witch in her little tower, they spend a lot of time together and they fall in love. And the main aspect of the story, the main plot line, is the growing connection between our main character and the witch. And I think that's why the romance works, because you see them spending a lot of time together. I'm gonna be honest, a lot of the time they spend together doesn't really happen on the page, which is kind of what made me not love this book as much as the other ones that I'm recommending here, but I still wanted to mention it. It's a very kind of wholesome romance, because it's also very much about not fitting in and finding solace in another person that also doesn't fit in, but then being able to fit in together with each other as a couple. It is young adult, so again, not spicy at all. And I would say that the romance in this, it's not very full of chemistry or anything. It's very more kind of like cutesy and very wholesome. Then the next book I'm going to talk about, I'm only going to mention because I've seen so many people call this a romantasy. That's a stretch to call this a romantasy, but you know, I am gonna recommend it because this is one of my favorite books that I read this year. That is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. This is a fantasy book, 100% majorly a fantasy book, and there is a romance in it. Yes, like a tiny little hint of romance. Well, I think I understand why people would call this a romantasy, because throughout the novel, You see our main character, Emily Wilde, who is this like scientist, like a biologist before Faye. And the majority of the novel, she is interacting with another scientist, her rival scientist. And there's like a budding romance between them, but there's barely any screen time or page time for the romance. It's just that they do interact most of the story. Why I personally think the romance works here really, really well is because both characters are yet again very clearly their own flawed, quirky characters. Neither one of the characters is there for the reader to fawn over, but you can tell why they work together. It's kind of an opposites attract situation. The male love interest, he's like Howl from Howl's Moving Castle, just extremely dramatic man. Chaos himself. I would even go as far to say that he kind of sucks, but I love to see him interact with Emily Wilde, our main character. Yes, this is an adult novel. There is no spice. There's just the faintest hint of romance in there. That being said, incredibly fun, wholesome, cozy Fae story. And then the last one that I am gonna recommend in this video, and I never thought I would ever do that, but I'm going to be recommending Bride by Ellie Hazelwood. Even though I only gave this book 3 out of 5 stars, I keep finding myself recommending it to my friends because I'm just like, it's such a fun experience to read this book. I recommend it to everyone. I would again say this is romance first with a plot built around it, just so that like there can be stakes and things can be happening, but it's very clear that the main focus of the story is the romance between this vampire and this alpha werewolf. If you think, oh my gosh, that sounds so corny, it is, and the book is very aware of that. The book is almost kind of like self-deprecating in its humor and genuinely so funny. So funny. The plot, kind of bad, not gonna lie. Didn't really care for it, but like I said, clearly the plot doesn't really matter here. Why does the romance work in this? It honestly doesn't. I think because the story is so silly, it doesn't really matter that at its core the romance really is your typical like alpha werewolf dominant man dude with like demure and cutesy vampire girl. It's very cliche, but it works because it's just a little silly. You can't take it seriously. And Ellie Hazelwood pays a lot of attention in this book on building the chemistry and the tension between the characters. I would say this is one of those romance books that is very like chemistry forward and kind of like spicy forward, as opposed to like a sweeping romance novel, a love story, you know? And she does that really, really well. Like the tension between these characters, palpable. It is an adult novel. It's very spicy, and I think it's done very well. Well, just know that, you know, it's werewolves and vampires, so it gets a little odd with it. You have to be open to that. At some point, it did get a little bit too much for me, but again, just give it a try, see if you like it. I think that's it. If, based on these recommendations that I've given you, you know of other romantasy books that would probably fit in this list and would probably fit like my personal taste, please do leave me some recommendations below, because I am always looking for more romantasy books that I would like. It's just that a lot of the popular ones I don't like. If you can recommend me some, I would be so happy with that. Yeah, so this wasn't a very long video, just a little quick recommendation video. I still hope you really enjoyed it. Let me know what you guys like in a romance book. Like, when do you think it's like cringy and cliche, and when do you just get like super sucked into it? I clearly just have a thing for romance books that I think all of these are like enemies to lovers almost. Clearly I just dislike it when love interests, especially male love interests, are clearly just written for the reader to fawn over, and I want to see the chemistry between two characters. I want to understand why these specific two characters fall for each other. And one thing that I've noticed really missing in my list of recommendations is that I don't really have a lot of recommendations with some spice in them. So if you have recommendations with that, I would actually love to hear that, and just let me know what you think. To end this video, I want to thank all of my patrons with a special shout out to all of my elite Patreon members. If you want to gain access to my book club, you can become a Patreon member, and you can do so using the link in my description. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you soon in another video very soon. Goodbye!